Well, on to the nation's capital now, where 5 alleged human traffickers are expected back in the Pretoria Magistrate's Court this morning after having been arrested on New Year's Eve in Sunnyside. Now, one of the suspects allegedly lured a 17-year-old girl from her home in Hammanskraal, north of Pretoria, in March last year. The victim was kept against her will, forced to take drugs and subjected to sexual exploitation. The Hawks rescued the 17-year-old and a 25-year-old woman from a flat in Sunnyside. 4 male Nigerian nationals and a South African man face charges of contravening the Trafficking in Persons Act for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So for more, we are joined now by SABC News reporter Ofentse Setimo, who is following the story for us. Ofentse, good morning, and I see you are outside the court already. Just by way of background, anything more that you know that we can add to what we already know about the story at this stage?
Absolutely, Sakina, and good morning to your viewers. Well, what I can tell you is that during the first appearance of the suspect, everyone was chased out of court as they had not actually appeared during an identity parade. So the prosecution actually felt that, if we had the details as media and we broadcast those details of the accused, then there was definitely going to be trouble for her in order to build a case against the 5 accused. And as you rightfully mentioned, they were actually arrested on the 31st during a joint operation between the Hawks, Serious Crime Investigations, and also the SWAT, the K9 unit, after getting information from a human trafficking website where they got the information about the 17-year-old that you mentioned about. And after extensive investigations, that's when they started raiding some of the flats in Sunnyside, which were suspected of housing some of these victims of human trafficking. And upon arrival at those flats, there was another woman that was found there, a 25-year-old, of which we don't know much about the details, as the Hawks response was based on information about this particular 17-year-old who actually left her home around March last year. You can imagine the parents must be devastated if a minor is left since March and we're in the new year now, and they don't know her whereabouts. But what we know about the 2 women is that the authorities have actually placed them at a place of safety. This is the information we got last week when the suspects were actually appearing, and just prior to them actually going for an identity parade. So we would assume that they put them to a place of safety so that they would not be intimidated and they would not interact with some of the people that are linked to the people that actually kept them hostage. We know that the suspects are between the ages of 40 and about 18 years old. One of the suspects is as young as 18 years old. So further information is actually going to come out today, as the previous appearance we were actually not allowed to be inside out of fear that the case might be bungled if the information of the 5 accused were to be broadcast. So none of the information about the accused is actually in the public domain. We know there's a similar case that's happening in the Joburg area, and those suspects have been named, as when they were appearing after being identified during an identity parade, Sakina.
With regard to the 17-year-old, and we understand she was lured from her home in Hammanskraal to this flat in Sunnyside. But do we know anything more around what exactly happened in terms of getting her to leave home to this place where she was ultimately trafficked?
At this moment, the information is actually very thin, Sakina. The law enforcement agencies are remaining very tight-lipped about this 17-year-old, as you know that she actually is a minor. But from what we understand, there were some sort of interactions between the suspects and the lady, and to a certain extent, it was one of those, maybe it was an innocent visit to a friend, which turned out to be a nightmare where you're being held against your will, and to a certain extent, you're being subjected to sexual exploitation. That's the little information that we have thus far, but we believe that once we enter the court, as I mentioned earlier, that previously we were not allowed inside court, most of the information will start trickling out, and then we will definitely give you that information as and when it is in our possession. Sakina.
As you said earlier, Ofentse, one can only imagine how exasperated the family and the parents of the 17-year-old must be. Has anybody had opportunity to speak to them at all?
Well, because of the nature of the case, it might be a situation where when you interview the parents, by virtue of interviewing them, you might be also identifying the victim. And you know, such victims, most of the time, we don't really identify them. So it might be a bit of a challenge for us to actually speak to either the family or a family spokesperson, as that might give a hint as to who this 17-year-old is. And we are trying by all means not to actually name her to avoid victimization and the likes.
And Ofentse, you did say the state are very cautious and worried that they should not bungle this particular case. But are they confident that they do have a strong case to build on?
Yes, no, when we interacted with the prosecution, there was some sort of sense that, you know, they have a very strong case that has actually been picked up against the 5 suspects, as this was the subject, the arrest on the 31st was the subject of a lengthy investigation. And when they decided to pounce, they already knew the type of information they had. They knew where they could find the 17-year-old. So there was some sort of surveillance that was actually placed on the suspects for quite some time. And we know that out of the 5, 2 were actually linked to yet another human trafficking case. In fact, they were fugitives of the law since September 2019, and the authorities had been looking for them. But due to this sting operation, which comprised of the Hawks and the Tshwane K9 unit, that's how they were able to actually apprehend these suspects. As you know, some of them are not South African nationals, and they use forged identity documents, if I may put it that way. So they are able to relocate to another place, find another identity, and then it becomes very difficult for the law enforcement agencies to trace them, as they would have not been formally registered as people that are formally in the country. In fact, part of the postponement last week was to try and establish the status of some of the suspects, as they are not South African national. So they're going to try to establish their status, try and establish their addresses where they are residing, and today they are actually going to make a bail application. And we suppose for us to get to this stage, it means they might have ticked all the boxes in terms of the identity parade, in terms of verifying their addresses, and also in terms of establishing their legal status here in the country, as they are, some of them are actually not from South Africa, Sakina.
And just finally, Ofentse, what time are those proceedings kicking off, and will you be allowed to broadcast from inside court?
We are going to make a formal application in front of the magistrate to sort of give reasons why we should actually be able to broadcast these proceedings live. I don't believe there would be any reasons why they would not actually allow us to be inside, as there is a lot of public interest on the case, and people are actually curious as to whether there might be other cases that might be coming up where these guys might be involved in. So we will definitely start around just after 10. We will be inside court, and we will try and bring you these proceedings live, Sakina.
Well, thanks so much for that scene setter, SABC News reporter Ofentse Setimo, who is following that particular story for us, and proceedings to get underway just after 10 in the Pretoria Magistrates Court this morning.